Hello, and welcome to the Schmidt List, the podcast for people dedicated to managing successful projects, developing impactful products, and building engaged teams. And now, here's your host, Kurt Schmidt.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to episode 24 of the Schmidt List. On today's show, I'm talking to Scott Propp. He's an executive coach, speaker, and consultant. Today, we're going to talk about why leadership is the currency of success in today's world. I really enjoyed my conversation with Scott, and I hope you do too. And that's enough for the intro, so let's jump right into the conversation. So, Scott, welcome to the show.
It's good to be here.
Thanks for coming. Tell me a little bit about your background. How did you get into what you're doing these days? Where did you start out? And tell me a little bit about what you're doing on a day-to-day basis now.
Yeah. Well, the Twitter version is 3 decades in corporate America, followed by half a dozen years of consulting. The LinkedIn version is a little bit longer than that. Spent some time in family business as a teenager, learned all kinds of things about outdoor power and building businesses and rebuilding businesses. Went off and became a member of the Retail Clerks International Union and did a slug of retail, which turned out to be incredibly informative. Grabbed a couple of degrees in engineering, did 3 decades around the world in 20 different countries and a dozen different business models. And exited that and then headed off into consulting land in 2011.
That's great. And in the type of work you're doing these days, who are the typical type of people that you're working with more often? I know you do a lot of speaking engagements,
sure,
but you also do a lot of consulting.
Yeah. So I do a fair bit of both. Usually, I'm helping, when I'm doing speaking, I'm helping the organization to form a vocabulary, right? They usually have all kinds of things that they talk about, but rarely are they using the same words that mean the same thing. So a speaker can come in and lay a nice platform and establish a nice structure for them to all get on the same page. So not uncommonly, it's a chief marketing officer, chief technology officer, somebody like that wants to get that platform in place that will bring me in. On the custom consulting side, I do a lot of what we call front of house work, right? So I'll come in and do a diagnostic, a day or two spent interviewing senior executives, putting it up against a model I've developed to really try to find where the friction is in their process, and producing 3 to 10 pages of insights and analysis, and not uncommonly that will guide it towards consulting. And then lots of one-day workshops, as is the case with lots of folks in my trades.
I'm guessing a lot of people don't bring you in when things are great.
Almost never.
Okay.
Gosh, we just had the best quarter ever. Can we get a consultant in here?
Yeah, I live in that space too. So what are some of the common areas that you're seeing as of recent where people are having the most trouble? You mentioned nomenclature, obviously, and I'm guessing as companies are moving towards a more agile perspective, a more product focus, those are some of the areas. Are there any other or areas that you would say that you're seeing more often, the more opportunities that companies need to be focused?
Yeah, it's fascinating. Even in the last 6 months, I've seen a shift. People were bringing me in to do more general purpose innovation kind of culture platform stuff. But most recently, they're coming up with projects and programs to keep up with expectations versus set new expectations. Things have been so good out there for a while that stakeholders, shareholders, employees, ESOP programs are all expecting this ridiculous growth. And it's scaring people a little bit.
Right.
So now we're starting to do workshops around, wow, we've had these ideas. They've been below the line for a long time. Below the line does not mean it's not valuable. It just means we can't evaluate it inside.
Yeah.
So that is more of the case. Helping to put take the variance out of the ideas that they know are probably pretty good, but need some help with.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up because that's something that I'm seeing happen more and more, which is people having a hard time balancing innovation with keeping the lights on. I'm guessing that's a spot where you really have a lot of impact, right?
Yes.
And so what are some of the first things you do? I know you talked about interviewing people and understanding the space you're in, but I feel like there's a bit of a chasm there where you could be on either side, kind of floating towards What are some of the ways you go about coaching people through that balance of making sure that you can stay innovative, but you can also keep the products and services that you're already delivering on at a high quality?
Yeah. Well, one of the first things I'll do is look at how they're keeping books themselves right now. So throw all the metrics and pictures and graphs and everything that you have my way. Let me take a look at them. And while they're interesting at level 1, what's really interesting is what they're not measuring usually, right? There's usually some negative space in that's really fascinating. And not uncommonly, they have this enormous clump of projects right around the core, and then some really wild projects that somebody's dreaming about that are on the bottom of the list somewhere, and almost nothing in between. So one of the biggest things I'm looking for is how to bump them out of their comfort zone, either towards more market or towards more risk on the product side for their existing market. And that is not uncommonly the first line of coaching and consulting I do, is just how to get them into that intermediate zone. That helps them get that next leg up.
So is that a way to kind of make them feel like there's forward movement, but still have a foot grounded in reality a bit?
Sure. Yeah, it's kind of like a map. So if you think of the work we do as on one side of the river is kind of constant and what we always do, and maybe 7 layers across the river is like total chaos and whitewater. What I kind of picture is most clients kind of float right near the shore. They're in layer 1 or layer 2. And there's a whole lot of value with just a little bit more risk and a little bit more insight that we can bring to them from the outside in layers 2 and 3. Take that little step, and it doesn't have to be this, bonsai jump out of the airplane with a parachute risk. It can be pretty simple.
Yeah.
Just a little different people group than we usually talk to.
Sure.
Yeah.
Well, and I'm guessing, and I've heard you talk about this before, about there might be a smaller group or a contingency inside the organization that does want that change. They do want to do those things, but they feel afraid to bring it to the foreground.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah, you're talking about what I title a complete growth leader, people inside the organization that have gained insight for whatever reason, right? They've solved a bunch of customer problems, or they are close to manufacturing and see some opportunities, or for whatever reason, they're perhaps more attuned with a group of folks than the larger organization is. And equipping them to be able to put that together in a fairly rational and insightful summary, and then teaching them how senior management thinks about that and wants to know about before engaging in it in a way that doesn't get them, devalued in some way by risking too much or exposing too much early, is some of the work I do.
Yeah, and what I've found, and I've talked about this ad nauseum on the podcast, is about changing incentives for those groups, right? Because if you really want to drive behavior, if you really want change, right, you need to change the way that people are being incentivized.
Sure. Yeah, risk and reward needs to have some alignment with an incentive structure. On the other hand, people are, at least my experience as entrepreneurs, know that they're not going to get the crazy wild returns that an outside entrepreneur is going to receive. But they do want to be recognized. They mostly want to have that recognition that they've moved the ball, right, and given some freedom of action internally to be able to do that.
Yeah.
But it's if you think about, there's a continuum. When you want to work with the big innovation toys of a large firm, that comes with a lot of responsibility and a lot of oversight. And if you want to do small things, right, you'll get a fair amount of freedom of action. But the minute you move towards big scale, you're going to run into big boy toys come with big boy rules.
Yeah, right. Well, and you want that big impact, obviously. So be careful what you ask for. Be prepared, I guess.
Yes.
So I've seen where in some of these organizations, and I'm glad you used the word entrepreneur, because I find that word fascinating, with that we've had to come up with a word to describe an individual that is doing what they were actually hired for, in a way, right? I mean, right. Obviously there's the whole stay in your lane thing, right? But I don't care what size of company you're hiring, you're hoping that the person you're bringing in is going to bring more to the table than what was on their resume, right?
Yes.
I mean, that would be the hope, right?
Yep.
But we have this term entrepreneur these days, which people are talking about, which usually says to me that it's somebody that has to kind of buck the system, that they're fighting against the machine that is, in some cases, made them who they are. And with that, then you have the people problem, the politics of it all. And in your experience, you've worked in large organizations, you've worked alongside them, you've been adjacent, parallel, all the different 6 different ways to Sunday, working with them. When it comes down to those politics, where what I've seen is that a lot of that innovation and balance, a lot of it's being stagnated because of the people, not necessarily the processes. So as a consultant, as somebody who's coming in, what are the challenges you see when you're trying to make a change within that organization? Is it just the fact that you're there is enough to say they're ready to move? Or are you usually running into a small contingent of people that are like, why are we here again?
Yeah, well, there's no such thing as a typical client. Every client has their own culture, their own way of thinking about it. But there always are pockets of people. It's almost universal. There's typically, subject matter experts that have developed a great deal of autonomy in the organization, the kind of a big dog approach to being able to kind of absorb light and be able to reflect it back to the organization.
Right.
There's the very forward and progressive person usually running the reach out or advanced development portfolio. You can almost, envision him or her as you walk through the hallways, right? And then a group of folks that kind of aspire to, hey, let's do more than we're the base job description's asking for, right? And it's out of that mix, kind of pulling that together, that you really need to kind of find 4 things, right? You need to find someone that's got some, if they're not an official architect, they actually can kind of carve things out of the fog, right, into something that's semi-tangible.
Yeah.
You need to find someone that's got this champion gene, I call it, but basically the ability to manage up and extract authority and budget and insight, right, and kind of grab that out of the sky and get that applied to the architected idea. And then you need to have this lateral connection through the organization, people that can actually go to their peer, find some common ground, find a way to get some stuff done. And all that gets kind of set on this foundation, I call it establisher. But anybody that moves an organization somewhere has this essence of anchoredness and belonging in the firm. These aren't people that just showed up and are recent new hires typically. Usually these people are long tenured, have some foundation, have some insight, and are able to carry some gravitas to kind of move the firm around. And in those 4 dimensions, a lot of good things can happen. So
some of the issues that I've seen with that is that you don't actually have those individuals that have those capabilities, where I've walked into rooms and there's been the one person is saying, I had this idea 2 years ago. And I want to say, so what did you do with it? And what I'm guessing is, and my experience is, as I've sat on it and I shared it in an email, and then nobody showed up at my desk to help me implement this.
Yes.
Right.
Yes.
But you're talking about somebody that's more proactive, somebody that's managing up, somebody that's managing laterally, who's building bridges, right? Not just lighting fires and hoping that people come around and warm their hands at, right?
Right.
If you were coaching somebody who has those great ideas, but they're feeling intimidated to start doing that, to being that person who's going to manage up or to go across the aisle, as it were, to start building that bridge, what are some of the first steps that you would ask them to think about?
The thing that most people forget about is kind of day zero. Kind of day zero is you need to take a step back and figure out a little bit what the firm is about. Start at the largest possible sense and begin to understand what's really that underlying thing that needs to happen. The more you can anchor your insight to the macro, the more powerful it will be, right? And if you're lucky enough to work in a publicly traded organization, they have to put an amazing amount of information on the street in the 10 Qs, right? So just do a little bit of surfing, read what's publicly stated. You can listen to the analysts' phone calls. I mean, there's an enormous amount of information out there. And begin to anchor your opinion a little bit. And by finding that that platform, that first platform to have the discussion, you can get a lot of work done. And I call it, have a dozen informal conversations. That's my first coaching item to anybody that thinks they have an idea inside an organization. Just have these half a dozen to a dozen conversations, and you will learn an enormous amount, right? That one page of notes will be extremely valuable.
Yeah, that's your research, right? And while your idea may be good, there's nothing wrong with testing, right?
Chances are really good. I will guarantee you that after a dozen conversations, your idea